and there was something weird behind you. What was that?
Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, who did the interview, she said, "John, there were two grays that were peering over your right shoulder." It's the first recorded interview in history that aliens actually appeared during the interview.
John and Joyce Edmonds have always wanted a Western-style ranch. The couple hope to retire in a peaceful environment. John was once a therapist and Joyce, a recently retired FBI agent. On moving day, John and Joyce were shocked to find the former tenant's possessions left behind. Frustrated, the couple reached out to the real estate company and informed them that the previous tenants left behind their belongings.
Home to mysterious and unique paranormal activity. With a history of sightings of UFOs and unearthly beings, Stardust Ranch has gained a reputation for being a one-of-a-kind destination for the adventurous. Located in Rainbow Valley, Arizona, and owned by the Edmonds family, Stardust Ranch has been the setting for many supernatural sightings.
According to its owner, John Edmonds, Stardust Ranch also has one quality you won't find anywhere else.
Well, we have two alien portals. We have one in the front and one in the back.
Frustrated, the couple reached out to the real estate company and informed them that the previous tenants left behind their belongings. They were assured that all of the belongings would be removed in just a few hours or so. Eventually, all the belongings were removed. The Edmonds went out to run a few errands, but once they returned back home, they noticed that the belongings were simply just tossed into the couple's pool. John, now beyond irritated, decided to call the Realtor hotline phone number, but was quickly told their ranch was sold as is. Once the Edmonds removed all the former tenants' belongings from their pool, John noticed a strange man carrying a large sword. John asked the stranger if he could help him find something. In return, the man claimed to have resided on the property. John said he and his wife were now the new owners of the ranch, and they did not have a need for an additional resident on the premises. The man respectfully accepted John's wishes, but he quickly responded to John and said,
"You're going to live to regret this, and there are monsters on the property, and I killed them."
After a while, John noticed orbs of light drifting above the ranch. Glowing UFOs were visibly spotted, and shadow specters running from room to room inside the home. John attempted to overlook the unusual activity to a figment of his imagination, but as soon as their ranch, dogs started turning up disintegrated. He began to panic. John began to ponder how on earth was this happening to their animals, and how on earth was this conducted. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning. Missing body parts would begin to turn up on a regular routine. After a while, crazier figures started to manifest in their bedroom. The Edmonds began to experience visits from gray aliens. At first, the couple chalked it up as nightmares. Joyce first thought she had a dream about someone injecting an object into her forearm, but when she awakened that morning, she realized there was a scar left over from what she thought was a dream. The leftover mark was enough for John and Joyce to realize this was for real. After several days, John and Joyce heard their dogs barking, aggressively out by their kennel. John would go out to investigate in an effort to see what the fuss was all about.
Followed by orange orbs. That's when the uninvited guests arrived.
Literally gray aliens that attacked animals. They were in the house.
John recalls one unforgettable experience involving gray aliens attacking his wife.
Actually levitated her out of the bed in the master chamber, out into the parking lot, and tried to draw her up into a craft.
He was astonished to find a deceased gray alien lying on the ground. It appeared the dogs had defended their territory and attacked the visitor to its death. The Edmonds agreed that the horrific nightmares they were having of the Greys
were indeed true, and believed the beings had sinister intentions. For John and Joyce, this meant war.
The couple already had an arsenal of guns, ammo, and an array of Japanese swords. John was met with success in keeping the beings away from their homestead. John believes the aliens were able to open portals from other unknown dimensions. John would battle these aliens for months at a time. Unexpectedly, one of the beings manifested before John's eyes. But he quickly attacked the creature. Appearing to have injured the invader, it vanished into thin air. To his followers on social media, John shared images of his bloody sword. John allegedly claims to have killed 18 entities, claiming, if you don't remove the head, the bodies will disappear or phone home. After growing amount of evidence, the Edmonds sought out scientific evidence to help prove that these attacks were real. They contacted a scientist who was a practicing physicist and a crop circle investigator, Dr. W. Levengood. Levengood was a peer-reviewed scientist and a ufologist by hobby. John allowed Levengood to run blood tests from the sword he had used to kill the gray aliens. Within the samples that he had tested, the doctor believed he had indisputable proof of extraterrestrial blood, due to elements of hemoglobin, which is found extraterrestrial objects. Levengood was excited to share this information with his colleagues and the scientific community. However, unfortunately for the Edmonds, Dr. Levengood died unexpectedly at the information from Levengood's research would end due to his passing, and with no apprentice to continue his findings. Many conspirators and ufologists contemplated Dr. Levengood's work and wondered if his conclusions were extraordinaire, which perhaps may have put his own life at risk. Although his family repudiated these claims and stated that his death was unrelated to his research, the Edmonds would attempt to have other specialists review their evidence. But unfortunately, nobody wanted to get tainted with such claims, and the ones who would agree demanded massive amounts of monetary compensation. John and Joyce decided to obtain other methods of evidence by ghost hunters and through other paranormal investigations, such as psychics and ufologists, with convincing photos, testimonies, and audio-video evidence. It consequently attracted more debunkers rather than producing a smoking gun for the existence of extraterrestrial dimensional beings. Unfortunately for the Edmonds, John would continue battling the beings for years to come. Why does the paranormal gravitate to Stardust Ranch? John believes that there are interdimensional portals on the ranch that the beings use to travel in and out of, kind of like a wormhole. If you're familiar with the northeastern Utah Skinwalker Ranch, you will find similarities between Stardust Ranch. Ironically, when the Edmonds listed the property for sale for approximately $2 million, it attracted an aerospace tycoon by the name of Robert Bigelow. Unfortunately, for John and Joyce, Mr. Bigelow would ultimately pass on the purchase of Stardust Ranch. Currently, the Edmonds have continued to fight off aliens and the paranormal, but feel that they are suffering from in their advancing age. As of now, the ranch allows brave visitors by appointment who dare to spend a night at the property. Stardust Ranch has now been relisted for $5 million. Well, what do you think? Would you book an appointment at Stardust Ranch? Or if by chance you had an extra $5 million lying around, would you perhaps be interested in investing in producing evidence of extraterrestrial, trans, dimensional beings? If so, let me know in the comments down below. Please remember like or subscribe to our channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot.
I grabbed a sword and I killed all three of them.
You killed all three of them?
Three of the guys.
This is Whitley Strieber. I wish to warn you, it is hard to hear, so there is very frightening screaming. It should not be listened to by little children.
UFOs, many people dismiss the stories of visitors from other worlds, but Whitley Strieber has written convincingly of such encounters since he says he was first visited by these aliens in 1985.
Chapter 1.
Whitley Strieber was born June 13, 1945, in San Antonio, Texas. He attended Central Catholic Marianist High School, and in 1968, he would graduate from both University of Texas, Austin, and the London School of Film Technique. According to Whitley Strieber, he would state that perhaps he may have been subject to other unworldly beings that may have visited him in his past. Whitley would later meet his wife, Ann Strieber, who was a school teacher, and later the two would marry in November 1970. They have one son, Andrew Strieber. Strieber would later relocate to New York City. Whitley would later become a vice president for an advertising firm. Later, in 1977, Whitley would begin his first few popular novels, such as The Wolfen 1978 and The Hunger 1981.
Wolfen. Help her, for she has begun to feel the awful horror of the hunger.
The success of the two books. Both novels would later be made into motion pictures. That's, according to DallasNews.com, almost a decade before the events in Communion occurred. Strieber shared a small Manhattan apartment with his wife. Furthermore, a series of strange events would foreshadow things to come. Chapter 2. The night of December 26, 1985. On December 26, 1985, Whitley's cabin was located up against a large, state-owned area of 15,000 acres in Kingston, New York. Whitley mentions during that time, the cabin wasn't located on any maps. Whitley Strieber went on an excursion with his wife and son in order to get away from their cramped Manhattan apartment. For the Striebers, it seemed like a good time as they ate their Christmas dinner leftovers and went to bed early.
And Whitley's son is 7 years old, and on spring break, they come up here for a few days, which is very normal for them.
I would go downstairs every night and check on him. I sometimes would sit outside the door of his room with a shotgun.
And when he goes out there, he sees this craft just above the tree line, and it's huge. It's filling the sky, and the thought occurs to him, oh my God, they've taken my son.
Sleeping in sunlight. These lights came, big bright light came in my room. And sometimes my dad comes in to see how I'm doing in the middle of the night, but he doesn't bring in the searchlight, so. I'm sleeping, and I get scared. I think it's a burglar or something, so I pull the covers over my head and sink down. And then something pulls it down, and I see the face that's on Communion.
Whitley would recall an obsessive habit of checking the locks and windows. I could see this as true, due to Whitley living in New York City, roughly a decade prior to the evening of 1985. That night, Whitley would wake up in the middle of the night and could recall being filled with fear. He had a sense of dread. He recalls hearing a whooshing sound, which startled him to sit up suddenly. He had an alarm system installed in the cabin, so he was confident that no one could get in. When Whitley woke up again, he immediately was aware of a presence in the room. He stated that he had blackout and could tell something happened to his body. He recalls being paralyzed and remembers a feeling like going up in a fast elevator as he saw the trees whipping past him. Whitley would find himself waking up. But he couldn't move. Shadow figures began to dart around, and he wasn't quite sure what was going on.
This was his description.
No, I see them as, when I've seen those people, they were like people in the room.
You don't know if they have a nose or ears or eyes?
Well, it was dark, and they're a very dark color, a dark blue color, and you just can't. But there are others that are taller and more willowy, and I've seen them quite clearly, and I've had them painted for the covers of the two books. And they have very large eyes, some very black and some other colors, and quite triangular, thin faces. And I am talking to you about a real thing, I'm pretty sure.
Whitley was devastated after the visitors inserted a needle into his head. He then remembers blacking out. Chapter 3: The Aftermath. Whitley woke up in the morning feeling confused. He felt that he had been in a fist fight the night before. He would later make a visit to the doctor's office. As he begins to tell the doctor the sequence of events, the doctor would carefully examine Whitley and say, "To be honest with you, Whitley, it really looks as if you've been abused." The following weeks,
I wouldn't say I was in a normal state of mind at all.
Did they come into your house then?
Into my bedroom, yeah. But I woke up and saw one of them. They made noises. There was noise downstairs. And I woke up and saw one of them standing in the doorway of the bedroom.
But every American has his alarm system.
It didn't go off. It was turned on, my alarm system. And yes, I do have an alarm system. It just didn't go off.
According to your wife, you completely changed from that day on.
Whitley would begin to fear that something might happen to his family. He later thought maybe his wife and son might be better off staying somewhere else. As his memories began to return, he just couldn't believe them to be true. Whitley at first thought he had been drugged by somebody or been hypnotized and had the experience implanted into his mind. He did not want to believe that he had been abducted by aliens. Later, after some research about his abduction, he discovered that there had indeed been UFO activity in the area, specifically across the Hudson Valley, which oddly is where Whitley's cabin was located.
I don't know.
Not quite.
I'm going to tell you something, honey. I don't know what the hell it is.
It was a whole huge flap of the Hudson River Valley of UFO sightings, which was still just in the process of ending when Whitley's abduction took place. This was located approximately and only 30 miles away.
Arguably, the most famous sighting in the Hudson Valley hotspot concerned beings from underground, as was the case with best-selling horror novelist Whitley Strieber, who wrote about his own experience in his book, Communion.
My wife and I had bought a cabin in the western extreme edge of the Hudson Valley. And in December of 1985, I woke up in a room, not my bedroom, in the middle of the night, and the room was filled with two kinds of figures.
With its star, Christopher Walken.
I said to Whitley the other day that I had never had such an experience, or really anything, including deja vu, right? That's not something that happens to me. And I said that I'd never had anything like that. And he looked at me very seriously and he said, well, you're about to.
And then all of a sudden, one night in December of 1985, this very peculiar event took place.
Yeah, you were visited.
I was not visited. I woke up in what appeared to be a nightmare situation in this stuffy little round room with all of these large-eyed sort of faces peering at me, and a machine that kept saying, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" Which I realized when I heard this between screams that I was screaming, which I was so panicked I was even...
Of course, it would be normal to.
Yeah,
Frightened.
and I worked real hard to make this turn back into my bed, and my bedroom would not do that.
The cabin and its grounds, where most of these unusual events continue to take place, were open for the Encounters of the Fourth Kind film crew, with Mr. Strieber serving as host.
When they come here, we often hear a sound immediately above the house that will come across into this area. And myself and a number of other people have seen things hanging over this deck or hanging in an immediate little clearing in the front yard, very small things, but quite large ones sometimes hanging over the deck. In December of 1985, when the visitors first took me, they carried me down through these woods, which I remember very vividly, to a clearing not too far from here, where I have since built a stone circle that I and the group of people who've had experiences here go to meditate at night.
The strange occurrences outside the Strieber cabin can only be compared to what happened inside.
But this is where I was sleeping on the night of December the 26th, 1985, when the visitors came in from the door across the room, and the next thing I knew, I was being literally carried out of the room in a state of paralysis.
The Whitley who lived here is lying in that bed right now. And when I get up in the morning, that Whitley is going to stay here. And when I leave here, that Whitley, that story, is going to stay in this house.
Chapter 5. Strieber's book, Communion, was published in February 1987. Communion was a nonfiction bestseller for 6 months. The book is based on his experience on December 26, 1985. It was Strieber's wife, Anne, who came up with the title of the book, Communion, a true story. The book was later made into a film made by Philippe Mora, starring Christopher Walken as Strieber and Lindsay Krause as his wife, Anne. The movie's release date was on November 10, 1989, with a budget of $7 million and a $1.9 million in box office sales. Unfortunately, it received a mostly negative reaction and was upsetting to Strieber about the portrayal of himself due to Christopher Walken's performance.
Well, regarding the movie Communion, Christopher Walken played somebody in it, but not me.
The motion picture was considered a box office bomb. However, in recent years, it has subsequently picked up a cult following. According to Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds a 33% approval rating, based on 12 reviews, with an average rating of 4.6 out of 10. Critics praised Walken's performance as the highlight of the film. The Los Angeles Times called his performance terrific and added, quote, "Walken dazzles, giving us an intelligent, talented man caught in a nightmare and fearing for his sanity," end quote. Chapter 6. Where is Whitley Strieber today? Currently, he resides in Santa Monica, California. Unfortunately, in 2014, he lost his beloved wife, Anne Strieber. He continues to host his weekly podcast on YouTube titled Dreamland Site. His website goes in depth about his ongoing encounters over the years. Whitley has experienced a resurgence in popularity in recent years. He co-authored a novel with the late radio host Art Bell, The Coming Global Superstorm, and later renamed The Day After Tomorrow, which in 2004 was later adapted into a motion picture starring Dennis Quaid. Whitley has also had his 1985 abduction retold on Discovery Plus a shock doc titled The Visitors, which was released in 2022.
My name is Anthony. I'm the owner of the cabin. We bought the cabin 3 years ago in 2018. And we didn't really know too much about it until we were walking through, and then they had mentioned that this belonged to Whitley Strieber. Yeah, I read the story back in '87 when I was a kid. It's always fascinated me, so I felt a real strong connection to the house.
As of now, Whitley continues to claim he is visited regularly. Well, what do you think of Whitley's abduction?
Brooklyn Bridge UFO abduction of Linda Napolitano is one of the most witnessed abductions in recent times. Who is Linda? So now let's get into it. Linda Napolitano is your average Catholic going mother in the late 1980s. She resided on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City with her husband Steve and 2 sons. During a chilly late evening, Linda had just gone to bed after some late night chores. On November 30th, 1989, Linda and her husband were asleep in their 12th story apartment. Linda states she was the last one that went to bed that night. Linda, she was in the middle of saying her prayers when she suddenly saw a creature standing at the foot of her bed.
I went into bed, I said my presence, I was about to be abducted.
She describes the creature as humanoid, gray in color and approximately 3 feet tall, throwing a pillow and starting to physically try to attack this gray creature in her room. She then becomes completely paralyzed to the point where she can't do anything then. All of a sudden, a bright blue beam starts shining through her bedroom window. In this rare 2014 interview, Linda goes in depth with radio host Dr. J.
And I saw this creature standing at the foot of the bed. By now, my knees are numb. And then it got on top of the bed, and it crouched down looked me straight in the eyes and hissed. They hissed. It was great. Before I knew it, the rest of my body was numb except my arms, so I picked up a decorative pillow and I threw it at this creature. And it fell back. And then I had that afterthought, well, now it's going to get even with me and hurt my family. By that time, after that, I don't know what happened.
She claims her window was closed and sealed shut with metal bars, is feeling her body being lifted off of the bed by a bright blue beam of light. And then the next thing she knows, Linda is floating through her window. It's almost like magic. Force literally folds her body into a fetal position while she is completely paralyzed by this unknown force. She then realized that she is now standing upright and floating above the city. Linda is now being pulled inside the ship with the 3 creatures that abducted her in a trapeze formation. The spacecraft had been outside her apartment long enough for citizens to witness her abduction. Around 5 in the morning. After waking up, she had just thought she had an awful nightmare, when in reality it feels as if she had just been in a spaceship. As she is waking up and attempting to recall what had just happened to her. However, the past 2 hours just felt really foggy. Linda had recently worked with a hypnotic therapist and would urgently reach out to Bud Hopkins. In April 1989, ufologist Bud Hopkins receives a letter from a woman named Linda Cortile. Linda writes that in 1976, she noticed a strange bump near her nose. Bud decides to follow up with Linda. He then organizes a meeting to discuss Linda's past experiences. They meet for the first time in Bud's office, where for an hour or so, she talks to him about her life and her alleged experiences. Linda's accounts do not immediately appear to be related to any alien abductions at that time. She then starts attending Bud's abduction support groups. Linda at first is just a passive listener, at least until something out of this world occurs, something that leads her to doubt her entire existence, which being the night of November the 30th, 1989, an event that changed her life forever.
After the passing of time and some hypnotic regression with Bud, Linda recalls some information on what happened on that November 30th. During her hypnotic regression, she describes the following. She could recall the New York City skyline as she entered the alien vessel, floating in the light slowly. They all ascended into the saucer-shaped craft. Once inside the ship, the humanoid creatures escorted Linda down a hallway that was lined with benches. As they passed various rooms, she heard the hiss of doors sliding open and closing. The creatures were quietly talking to each other, but they were speaking a language Linda didn't understand. They bring Linda to a bright room, and in the center of the room is a long table. This sent Linda into a panic, and she started screaming in her mind. She was screaming, "What do you want? From me?" But the words that came out of her mouth were in an alien language. One of the beings put a hand over Linda's mouth. Then she felt something in her nose. A long medical instrument was forced into her right nostril and was told to remain quiet in the alien's language.
What are they gonna do if he comes closer with his instrument at 30 feet?
Okay, now we're gonna turn that pain down very quickly. Just very quick, and now it's gone.
Bud Hopkins was a well-known painter in the New York City art world. He made a name for himself as a ufologist. He was well known for his investigations on alien abduction, and he even worked with Whitley Strieber. Bud investigated on many of cases of abduction. He wrote several books, including the bestseller Intruders and Missing Time.
It all began with this photograph. After the publication of his first book on UFO research called Missing, Bud received this picture from Kathy Davis of Indianapolis. Kathy claimed that the circle and strip of dead grass had appeared in her yard after she had seen a UFO in the area, and she wondered if the damage had been caused by a UFO taking off and landing. Oddly, she also mentioned that both she and her mother had similar scars, and neither of them could remember the causes. Her curiosity opened a floodgate of revelations. Under hypnosis, Kathy recalled not just the terrifying events of the night she mentioned, which culminated with her abduction, but several other close encounters that had occurred throughout her life.
Bud would hold many therapy-like sessions with witnesses, contactees, and alleged abductees. He also had a working relationship with Dr. John Mack. Linda Napolitano was working with Bud Hopkins on hypnotic regression sessions. Bud Hopkins had lived in New York City and lived close to Linda. She had written a letter to Bud stating that she had an implant in her nasal cavity during one of her abductions. The cavity was examined by a physician who insisted that she must have undergone surgery when she was younger. Linda could not recall any surgeries in her lifetime. In 1991, 2 years after the abduction, Linda reached out to Hopkins with an X-ray of her nose, showing a cylindrical object that Hopkins describes as having, quote, spiraling extensions that curl out away. From her face, quote, the X-ray was taken by a surgeon and Linda's niece, Lisa Baer, shortly after Linda claimed the object was gone. Hopkins reports that Linda visited a nose and throat specialist who confirmed the object was gone. A conspicuous ridge of built-up cartilage showed where it had once been embedded.
Linda Cortile's nasal cavity, I'll show you more of a close-up, a small object, which she recalled going in on the end of a needle. She had a scar there, and she remembered a round thing, but somehow it's as if it expanded once it was inside her nostril. And once the x-rays were taken, a couple of days later, she woke up bleeding from the right nostril. There was nothing there anymore. When we had a re-x-rayed, and there was a little cut where it had been. It's as if they somehow know what happened.
The case gained attention due to the fact that it involved a United Nations Secretary General at the time, Javier Perez de Cuellar, who was believed to be abducted alongside Linda. After the incident, the two bodyguards who were tasked with protecting Cuellar, Richard and Dan, were allegedly determined to find out what happened, even going so far as stalking Linda.
Bud would receive large amounts of mail from various contactees due to him having an open door policy. In February 1991, he received a letter that got his attention. Bud was blown away by this discovery.
Dear Mr. Hopkins, my partner and I are police officers. We have been in a serious dilemma because of our strict profession and our lack of knowledge on this subject.
Morning, about 3 to 3:30 a.m. In late November 1989, we sat in our patrol car under a strange oval hovering over the top of an apartment building, 2 to 3 blocks up from where we were sitting. Its lights turned from a bright reddish-orange to a very bright whitish-blue, coming out from the bottom of it. It moved out away from the building and lowered itself to an apartment window just below. We grabbed hold of each other and were going to get out of the car. But what could we do for that poor little girl or woman wearing a full white nightgown? She was floating in midair in a bright beam of whitish-blue light, looking like an angel. She was then brought up into the bottom of that very large oval, about 3/4 the size of the building across. This poor person was escorted out of her window. I don't know if she was willing or not. I don't think so, because it seemed as though she was being escorted up into this thing by 3 ugly but smaller human-like creae. After she was escorted up and in, the oval turned reddish-orange again and whisked away, coming in our direction. It then plunged into the river behind us, not far from Pier 17, behind the Brooklyn Bridge. Someone else had to see what happened that morning. I know what we saw, and will never forget it. Mr. Hopkins, the oval never came up from under the river. We know the building, and we know which window she came out of. Perhaps she was just a figment of our imagination. If she isn't, is she alive and well? We have to know. We're feeling much better now that we've had the chance to tell someone else other than ourselves. We wish to stay anonymous for the time being on account of our profession. If we should decide to seek this person out, and she may very well value her privacy as we do, and we respect that, we'll contact you again with further information if we do find her, and I hope we do. Many thanks.
After reading the letter, he was able to identify the woman that Richard and Dan were referring to, that woman being Linda Napolitano. Approximately about 2 weeks from Bud receiving the letter, he received a frantic call from Linda. She had stated that she had a very weird and awkward encounter with 2 self-claimed police officers. It was almost midnight when she heard a knock at the door. Linda stated that the two men were dressed in men in black, things like clothing, and showed her their badges. She was nervous during her 30-minute conversation. Richard almost started crying to Linda. Linda retold her experience in regards to her husband, and children. She states that they were put into such a deep sleep that she couldn't wake them up for several hours. She would eventually put a mirror under her son's nose to ensure he was alive. Why? To see if he had fogged the mirror. Linda told Richard and Dan that they should visit Bud in person, but the two were hesitant on doing that at this time. However, later the two would send a tape to Bud in regards of what they witnessed. The tape would begin mid-sentence. Here is an actual rare audio recording of Richard and Dan that I could find.
My father was very disoriented and embarrassed. This is what he said to me.
The 23 other witnesses who claim to have seen the UFO hovering above the bridge on that night.
I'm standing at exactly the spot where this very strange event was seen at 3 a.m. really on November 30th, 1989. A woman was driving from Brooklyn to New York, right down here in the outer lane. The car engine died, the lights went out, and she looked over to this building, the one in the distance with a little pointed roof, and at that point she saw a burst of light as a UFO hovering only a few feet above it turned on all of its lights. Two small figures below her and one above her.
Several years later, Bud Hopkins met with Queller at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, and the two briefly talk about the abduction of Linda. Javier Perez de Queller stated that he indeed witnessed the abduction, but would not come forward. Many sources of Bud Hopkins and published media believe that the UN was working with aliens to end the Cold War. The abduction wasn't just witnessed by Queller's bodyguards and other citizens. In fact, Janet Kimball, a retired phone operator traveling home from a late-night party, also witnessed it. Janet Kimball was on her way back home from a late-night retirement party. According to Bud Hopkins, the two communicated through letters, phone, and even met in person. She told him her car had stopped, and along with other drivers,
the surrounding neighborhood experiences a major power outage.
The scene she describes was quite chaotic, with people honking horns and shouting in dismay. She watched what she first thought was a movie being filmed, though she quickly realized that it couldn't be. Cortile's apartment is very near the bridge, but the other three witnesses send the case reeling into pretty wild territory. Two of them wrote to Hopkins, introducing themselves as New York policemen who'd seen the abduction from a car parked under the FDR Drive. Some workers of the New York Post even claimed that they had witnessed the event at the nearby New York Post, one of whom was an investigative reporter named Stephen Dunleavy. Another witness by the name of Yant Spence, a delivery driver for the Post, also recalls witnessing Linda's abduction on the Brooklyn Bridge. He claims to have first thought they were filming a movie.
They were witnesses from the New York Post newspaper.
Unfortunately, Dan was eventually committed to a mental facility due to their over-the-top attempt to get answers from Linda. It's believed that this incident left Richard and Dan terrified of what they saw and scared that they might be abducted in a similar manner in the future, as Richard and Dan had security detail at the United Nations. But none of them ever truly revealed what transpired on that fateful night. The founder and director of Mutual UFO Network, Walter H. Andrus, strongly believed in Napolitano's story and called it a definitely authentic case of human abductions by aliens. Andrus said he knows what the aliens are after. They have been using humans to further their species. Ralph Blumenthal is an award-winning reporter for the New York Times. He is the author of several books such as The Believer, based upon the abduction accounts from the late Harvard of Psychiatry, Dr. John Mack. Here is an interview from the YouTube channel Concrete, where Ralph recaps Linda's abduction.
There's actually a book by Bud Hopkins called Witnessed, and this is a story. Two security guards, they call themselves police officers, but let's say security guards, were escorting a VIP down Manhattan. In November, security guards got out and they saw a spacecraft approaching an 11-story building near the Brooklyn Bridge. They saw a woman, a figure of a woman, fly out of the window, surrounded by 3 alien creatures, all flying in the sky. He escorted her into the spaceship and it flew off. and plunged into the East River. The woman later came forward herself and contacted Bud Hopkins, which is really how the story started. And Bud Hopkins found some witnesses who said they were stuck on the Brooklyn Bridge when all traffic came to a stop. The power went out. They saw this woman, flying out of the window into the spacecraft. The thing is, the story was told to Bud Hopkins by the woman, who said she was the target of the abduction, and it was also told by these two security guards who said they witnessed it, who were driving down in Lower Manhattan.
Criticized by UFO skeptic Philip Klass.
UFOs will persist as long as there are people on this earth.
A former senior editor for Aviation Week of Space Technology magazine, he is known as the Sherlock Holmes of ufology. UFO Skepticism. Klass devoted several issues of his UFO Skeptics newsletter to the Cortile case, uncovering implausibilities and major discrepancies in her story and its handling by Hopkins. For example, Cortile later added to her story that her son had been abducted by aliens 2 months earlier, and that the craft that took her crashed into the East River. No such incident was reported by any witness. Klass said the two alleged security agents, Dan and Richard, have never been found, although Hopkins allegedly arranged for them to meet Cortile in her apartment. She later claimed that Dan kidnapped her from Manhattan Street and took her to a safe house. And Klass said Hopkins claimed to have received a letter from the third man who witnessed the incident, the world leader who refused to step forward. Despite mounting evidence against Cortile's story, even some MUFON members were skeptical. Andrus called it a case of the century. However, there's much skepticism about Napolitano. Some people compared it with the sci-fiction novel Night Eyes, originally published on March 1, 1989. But at the same time, there are 23 eyewitnesses who saw this strangeness that night. In his 1988 book, UFO Abductions, A Dangerous Game, Klass described the emergence of what he calls an alien abduction cult among UFO enthusiasts. The book examines numerous claims of alien stories abducting young children and taking flesh samples. Bud Hopkins' alien story.
Letters and drawings from people describing their own strange encounters with creatures like these.
These are very small, frail-looking figures, and all of the power or energy or force or whatever they seem to have really resides in the eyes.
Ufologist author Bud Hopkins wrote a book on Linda's experience titled Witnessed: The Brooklyn Bridge UFO Abduction. The book is over 400 pages of interviews, transcripts from hypnosis sessions, and even pictures. This has been called the most important UFO case of the 20th century. This book chronicled Linda's abduction and detailed the more unusual elements of her experience. Consider what Hopkins asks us to accept. To begin with, he tells us that, for the first time ever, a UFO abduction has been witnessed. Linda Cortile, a housewife who lives on the Lower East Side of Manhattan with her husband and 2 sons. Cortile isn't her real last name, but the other 3 witnesses send the case reeling into pretty wild territory. 2 of them wrote to Hopkins, introducing themselves as New York policemen who'd seen the abduction from a car parked under the FDR Drive, a highway that runs along the east side of Manhattan, facing Cortile's building. That wasn't the whole story, though. Later, they revealed that they were security officers working for an unnamed American agency and guarding a man Hopkins describes simply as an international political figure, but who was widely known to be Javier Pérez de Cuellar, at that time Secretary General of the United Nations. De Cuellar supposedly saw the abduction too, and with that one stroke, the case seems to get even more unbelievable. Though we might ask ourselves why De Cuellar should be any less likely to witness an abduction than any ordinary person. To make matters worse, De Cuellar allegedly wasn't the only top official there. Allegedly, he and his guards were part of a group coming late at night from the heliport on Governor's Island. According to a recent podcast, Ryan Sprague's Somewhere in the Skies, Ryan speaks to the former assistant of the late Bud Hopkins, Peter Robbins. Peter retells his insight of the case.
And downtown at the time, with 2 security people, was a very important diplomat. Once Bud had established who it was, it seemed so outrageous that the book does not mention who it was. It became an open secret and now is pretty much public knowledge that it was Pérez de Cuellar, who at the time was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So one reason the case is considered controversial is, yeah, right. please give me a break. The Secretary General of the United Nations was downtown at 2 in the morning. Why? Well, he may have had a romantic liaison. He's a married man. He was in a very important internationally diplomatic position.
And now things get really strange. The two security officers, known only as Richard and Dan. Hopkins says he never met them, doesn't know their last names, and knows their story only through letters and audio tapes they sent. Became obsessed with Cortile. They spied on her, showed up at her apartment, and even kidnapped her, spurred by a confused mixture of feelings. Fear for her safety, fear that she herself might be an alien, a sense of professional failure. Shouldn't they have tried to stop the abduction? And fight to be near Cortile, simply to prove that what they'd seen had been real. Dan, who began to lose his emotional moorings, then kidnapped Cortile a second time. And earlier, however, he told Hopkins that he, Richard, and DeCuller now remembered that they'd all been abducted along with Cortile. The aliens, Dan wrote, had telepathically identified her as Lady of the Sands. She'd held up a dead fish and told the three men, "Look and see what you have done." In yet another unpublished tidbit, Richard later said that Dan returned from the abduction clutching the dead fish and would have held on to it if he hadn't been persuaded to drop it from the car's window. Cortile hadn't consciously remembered that, but under hypnosis, she did recall the same details and can be seen on video after her hypnosis. Reacting with shock as Dan's letter is read to her. One curious sidelight here, and yet another amazement in this case, is that Richard, Dan, and DeCuller remembered everything without hypnosis. Richard, in fact, recalled a lifetime of abductions and set off another bombshell when he told Hopkins that he and Cortile had been abducted together many times, beginning in their childhood. They had formed a secret, shadowy relationship, one that existed only on the alien ships, and had become lovers. Richard, who had never married, was convinced he was the real father of her youngest child. Cortile, duly hypnotized, remembered all this too, right down to the pet names Richard said they called each other when they were with the aliens. Again, her shocked reaction was caught on video, though she won't comment on her son's paternity. Anyone who needs a pause right here, to pour a drink perhaps, or just to hyperventilate or scoff, should take one. Why? Responsible UFO researchers might ask, did things have to get this messy? Why did DeCuller have to be involved? Must we have this tabloid love affair? It isn't reassuring to learn that Richard, during his abduction with Cortile, Dan, and DeCuller, saw the aliens processing samples of earthly sand and brought some back with him. That's another first. The first time any abductee came back with anything from an alien ship. The aliens should abduct trained security operatives more often. Richard even was alert enough, he said, to snatch before and after samples, which, when examined with an electron microscope, allegedly show subtle differences. We're also asked to believe that yet another abductee called Marilyn Kilmer in the book was separately abducted with Cortile, DeCuller, and Cortillier's younger son, Johnny.
Emotionally.
One of his most remarkable cases is that of John Cortilia, an 11-year-old boy from New York's Lower East Side.
When it happened, I had woke up from my sleep, and I had the sudden urge to look out the window in my living room. So I got out of my bed, and I just, went into my living room. I looked out the window, and I saw something emerging from the water. So I didn't know what it was. I just watched it as it came toward my window. And as my mother passed me, I was screaming, and she didn't even hear me. So this thing just pulled me through the window.
John claims that these aliens took him aboard a UFO.
They just took me into the door, and I was just laid down onto my stomach looking out these windows. I do remember some sort of a scraping with a sort of long rounded object, sort of like a knife, scraping me or scratching me with it, trying to hurt me or something. I woke up the next morning like it was a dream, only though I knew it wasn't a dream.
Allegedly, Kilmer identified DeCuller from photographs, though not with complete certainty. She and Cortile describe what they saw each other wearing, and here again there's a video documenting their amazement as each correctly names what the other swears she to bed that night. But even now, we're not quite finished. In what might be the strangest episode of all, D. Queller had his driver stop his car while Johnny passed them on the street. Johnny then was 9 and asked Johnny if he'd like a present. When Johnny said yes, against his better judgment, D. Queller arranged to deliver the gift, which turned out to be an antique diver's helmet. I've seen the helmet. It sits in ornate bronze splendor on a wall unit in the Cortile's tiny living room, unabashedly out of place among the photos and other items you'd expect a lower middle-class family to display. How do we know it came from D. Queller? Because Hopkins showed Johnny photographs of distinguished older men, and Johnny picked D. Queller's without a moment's hesitation.
According to the late Bud Hopkins' wife, Carol Rainey, Linda has made crazy claims, such as being abducted by aliens along with John the Gotti Gambino family boss. You like pop music? Well, Linda claims she was a professional singer in a well-known pop band, claims to have met the Pope, claims to have been in the Twin Towers on the September 11th attacks, and furthermore claims to have been Fran Drescher from the television's show The Nanny's Doppelganger. That last part is a joke. Oddly, Fran Drescher also claims to have been abducted by aliens along with her husband, so there may be some sort of connection. Sadly, this incident is still shrouded in mystery, but by combining witness testimonies, letters, tape recordings from Richard and Dan, it's possible to piece together a greater understanding of what happened to Linda that night. Even today, over 30 years later, Linda lives in New York City, which still hasn't forgotten her traumatic experience that November evening. According to Linda, if I was hallucinating, then the witnesses saw my hallucination. That sounds crazier than the whole abduction phenomenon. So, the question today is, where's Linda? Linda is active on social media. She does have a Facebook profile. I did attempt to reach out to her in regards to any comments about the case, but unfortunately, I did not receive a response. Well, what do you think? Is the whole Linda case a big lie for fame, fortune? Let me know in the comments.
Eyes still closed, and there was no response from my husband. And that's when I did open my eyes and I looked straight ahead. And there was this thing, this creature, standing at the foot of my bed. And it was the first time I had ever seen that consciously. I was awake. I hadn't gone to sleep yet. I was saying my prayers. So by this time my legs were numb. And I sat up in bed, dragging my heavy legs with me, and turned up behind me and threw a pillow, big pillow, that I made. You would think that I stuffed them with rock. It was heavy. And I hit him too, that creature. And my next conscious memory, fragmented memory, was seeing white fabric flow up and over my eyes and then down again. And then I felt something, perhaps little fists or maybe an instrument, pounding on my back. And that was all I remembered. And then my next conscious memory was that of falling into my bed. I could have fallen anywhere from 2 inches up or 2 feet up or whatever, but I was conscious and I felt myself fall into bed.